Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it. All right? Uh-oh, Richard. Oh, wow. Wow. Will Smith just smacked the shit out of me.
Do you remember the iconic slap Will Smith gave Chris Rock in 2022? A moment so iconic it has its own Wikipedia entry and memes that could rival the entire catalog of cat videos. Will Smith, Hollywood's charming, multi-talented superstar, decided that the best way to handle a mild joke about his wife's hair was to storm the stage at the 2022 Oscars and deliver a slap so thunderous it echoed in the hearts of millions. Everyone's talking about it, everyone's replaying it, and everyone's secretly wondering, what if that slap wasn't just a random act of frustration? What if it was the catalyst for something bigger? If you're still watching, please subscribe to this channel and help us actually grow. We have a lot of mind-blowing series lined up for you. Hold on to your wig, folks, because here's the thing. What if that slap wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction to a bad joke, but the very spark that led to electricity? Oh, you didn't know? Will Smith didn't just slap Chris Rock. He slapped the universe into discovering one of mankind's greatest breakthroughs. Forget Benjamin Franklin with his kite and key. Will Smith was like, yeah, that's cute, but what if I just shock everyone into the future? Let's be real. Franklin was the boring kid in the class who tried to make lightning his pet project. Will Smith? He owned it. He didn't need a kite or a key. He needed a good mic, a crowd, and the guts to turn an impulsive celebrity meltdown into electricity itself. Now, before you start thinking, wait, how did this turn into a history lesson about science and slap-induced breakthroughs? Let me clarify. Will Smith didn't just discover electricity in the let's play with lightning kind of way. No. Will Smith was way too busy living his best life to waste time on dusty old experiments. He was too busy being the center of a universe, and who could blame him? If you're Will Smith, discovering electricity isn't about testing random theories in the rain. It's about making the world feel the energy of your presence. So, while Franklin's in the background, fiddling with strings and keychains, Will's out here, casually electrifying everything. He strolls into Philadelphia, a city that's still figuring out how to make their horses less stinky, and decides it's time for an upgrade. Forget candlelight. Forget fire. Forget all the primitive ways of doing things. Will Smith looks around, smiles, and says, what if we just make it so bright out here, no one has an excuse to be lazy at night? And bam, he creates the first ever electric light. And of course, he does it in the most Will Smith way possible. He didn't sit in a dark room plotting and thinking deep, scientific thoughts. No. Will Smith knew the real value of electricity was making people feel something. About transforming the world with style, flair, and, let's not forget, Will Smith's exceptional ability to look cool in anything. He steps up to his makeshift electric generator and says, okay, here's the deal. I'm about to light up this entire block and make it look fly. Who's with me? People, they're already hooked. They're into it. The first ever public electric light show goes off like a mini Coachella, but with more copper wires and less questionable fashion choices. And that's when Will Smith realized this wasn't just about showing off some new gadget. This was about empire building. Forget the Revolutionary War. Will was creating his own revolution. Electricity wasn't just science, it was a business. And Will Smith? He was about to run it. Let's break this down. Will Smith, with his insane charisma, which we all know is basically the most electrifying thing on the planet, starts running electricity like it's a new app. Streetlights? Lit. Houses? Lit. His name? A literal buzzword. And of course, Will did what Will does best. He sold it like a pro. He didn't just give away power for free. No. He charged for it. And not just pennies, but full on this is Will Smith, the genius who just lit up your life and charged you a monthly fee for it, prices. The whole city was on fire, with light, not violence. Thank you very much. Will turned electricity into the commodity. People were living in the 18th century, like it was 21st century luxury. Candlelight dinners were so last year. Will had businesses running on electric power. farms thriving under electric irrigation. Yes, somehow he invented that too. And even electric-powered boats sailing across the seas. Will Smith wasn't just changing history. He was rewriting it. But of course, you know who hated this, right? The boring scientists. The guys who liked their experiments with little candles and dusty old books. They didn't get Will. He was too flashy, too charismatic, too busy making everyone else look lazy in comparison. So they did what any jealous nerds would do. They tried to take him down. Enter the Franklins and Edisons of the world, who were all like, "Oh no, 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 Will. You can't just wow people with lights. You have to understand the theory behind it. You have to be all serious and scientific." And Will, with a smirk, replies, "Yeah, and while you're busy understanding, I'm out here changing the world." Let's be real. Will Smith didn't need to understand electricity like some lab rat. He needed to make it work, to get it into people's homes, to turn it into something that mattered. He did more for science in a single light show than those serious guys did in their entire lifetimes. By the time the 1800s rolled around, Will Smith wasn't just some guy who discovered electricity. He was the guy who revolutionized the modern world. Sure, others came along and improved his work, but no one did it with the same style, the same energy that Will brought. Will Smith made it clear that science wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about making people feel like they were part of something bigger, something electrifying. Literally. So now the question was no longer about who discovered electricity first. It was about who could control it, who would monopolize this electric empire that Will Smith had essentially set on fire. Was the world ready for someone like Will Smith to hold all the power? The world had been electrified. Not in the literal sense of glowing bulbs or flashing light displays, though that was certainly part of it, but in the much deeper, more insidious way that only Will Smith could pull off. Will wasn't just a celebrity playing with wires. He was the world's first ever electric mogul, a man who, with a simple flick of a switch, made the world not just brighter, but louder, faster, and more chaotic than ever before. Electricity was the currency now, and Will Smith was the one printing the bills. Or, more accurately, charging them. Will's rise to power was rapid and unstoppable, like a global Wi-Fi signal nobody could get away from. Forget Benjamin Franklin with his kite. Benjamin Franklin's vibe was officially dead. Franklin wasn't slapping the world into a new era. Will was. And it was this slap, the one that had echoed across Hollywood, that had made everyone question whether they were living in a world of reason or absurdity, that turned Will Smith from just a Hollywood star into the literal spark of a revolution. And like any good revolution, it was an empire waiting to collapse under its own weight. Now, here's the thing. Will Smith, as you might imagine, didn't just stop at lighting up a few cities. He didn't think small, not with his personality, and certainly not with his ambitions. He wasn't a man to quietly settle for a couple of electric-powered street lamps. No, 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 Will was thinking about world domination. And by that, I mean he created an empire, a vast, sprawling empire, powered by his own invention. An empire built on electricity, and more crucially, his name. Because why just invent electricity when you could make sure that it was branded? By the time Will's empire stretched from Philadelphia to Paris to Cairo, people were starting to wonder, what happens when you give one person all the power? I mean, let's be real. He wasn't just distributing light. He was distributing power. You couldn't even turn on a stove without paying a fee to Will. Want to boil some water for tea? Will's electric empire had you covered, but it'd cost you. Forget about heating your home in winter without his special Will coin. And yes, that was the currency of his empire. Power wasn't just for the rich. Now it was for the Will rich. Will Smith coin, patented of course, was now the official currency of the world. Want to buy a loaf of bread? That'd be 25 Will coins, please. Need to rent a horse-drawn carriage? Sorry, your credit's been maxed out. But don't worry, Will Smith was always there to recharge your account. It was genius. Pure genius. But of course, it wasn't long before that genius started to get a little too powerful. Because here's the thing about empires. They don't stay shiny and new forever. Will thought he could light up the world, give people the magic of electricity, and it would be a party forever. And for a while it was. People marveled at their new electric-powered homes, lit by the very name of Will Smith. He even invented electric-powered boats, because why should the revolution stop at land? So people were sailing across the seas in style, their boats buzzing with Will's electric power. But here's where things started getting sticky. As Will's empire expanded, so did the problems. And the problems weren't just about keeping the lights on anymore. Oh no. The biggest issue was that everyone was getting way too dependent on Will's electricity. It wasn't just a luxury, it was life. People's lives revolved around Will's grid. They couldn't eat, sleep, or function without it. The factories ran on his power, the homes, the businesses, everything. It was, for all intents and purposes, the greatest monopoly the world had ever seen. But you know what happens when you monopolize something too much? People start to notice. They start to complain. And what was the biggest problem of all? People weren't just complaining about how expensive it was to get power from Will. They were beginning to see the dark side of his empire. Will had lit up the world, yes, but in doing so, he had cast the deepest, most terrifying shadow over it. You see, what Will had forgotten in his attempt to bring light to the world was the simple fact that not everyone was built to bask in the glow of his genius. Sure, the rich and powerful were living it up, but the poor? The ones who had no Will coins to spare? They were stuck in the dark. Quite literally. These were the people who had been left behind in Will's charge to make the world brighter. The ones who couldn't afford to keep their homes powered up. They were the ones living in the shadows. Not only that, but as Will's power spread across the globe, it created a new kind of inequality. There were now two classes, those who had power literally, and those who didn't. And guess what? They weren't happy about it. Meet Ethan Sparks. Now, Ethan wasn't your average, run-of-the-mill villain. He didn't have a dark lair or a velvet suit, but what he did have was a chip on his shoulder the size of an electric grid. Ethan was a former colleague of Will's, once a promising scientist, now a disgruntled rebel who had seen the cracks in Will's shiny empire. See, Ethan knew that there was a darker side to Will's invention. He saw it before Will did. The power was corrupting the people who had it, and crushing those who didn't. And so, Ethan did what any good underdog hero would do. He started an underground movement. And by underground, I mean literally underground. Ethan started gathering people. Those who were tired of Will's electric dominance. The ones who couldn't even afford to run a simple light bulb without maxing out their Will coin credit. The electric underground was born, and Ethan Sparks became its leader. Ethan wasn't out there to destroy Will's electricity, per se. No. He just wanted to take back control. He wanted to make sure that no one man, no matter how charming or electric, could control the very power that kept the world spinning. But how do you fight an empire built on something as simple as electricity? How do you go up against the greatest technological breakthrough the world had ever seen? Easy. You shut it off. Ethan and his rebels started small, hacking into power grids, draining Will coin reserves, causing blackouts across the globe. It was like a modern-day protest, but with a much sharper edge. The world, which had once been gloriously illuminated by Will's empire, started to flicker. Cities went dark. Streets were eerily quiet. People gasped for power, for light. And they realized something they hadn't before. Maybe, just maybe, they didn't want to live in a world where Will Smith was the only one with the remote control. But Will Smith? He had no idea this was happening at first. He was still busy partying in his electric palaces, living it up like a god among men, until one day, just like that, the lights went out. And not just in one city or two. It was happening everywhere. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a random storm. No, this was deliberate. Someone was out to steal the very power Will had built his empire on. And that's when it hit him. Will Smith was no longer the only one with the power. There were others out there in the dark, and they were ready to fight, ready to take back control. And suddenly, Will wasn't so sure of himself anymore. Was his electric empire really the future? Or was it just a bright idea that had gone too far? Will Smith was a man who prided himself on being able to juggle everything. His electric empire, his fame, his family, and of course his charisma. He was a walking, talking power grid himself. People loved him. People needed him. He had single-handedly transformed the way the world worked. Cities ran on his electricity. Homes were powered by his vision. And he, of course, had made Wilcoin the world's most coveted currency. But there was one thing that no amount of electricity or fame could power through: his personal life. For years, Will Smith had been the face of stability in Hollywood. The charming, funny, slightly awkward guy who always had a smile on his face and a hug for his fans. He was America's sweetheart, and the world had come to love him not just for his acting, but for his persona. The clean, crisp image of success and family. But as his electric empire expanded, the cracks in that picture-perfect life began to show. And as much as he tried to ignore them, they were getting harder to ignore, just like the underground revolution that was building right under his feet. It was supposed to be the dream. Will had it all: his wife, Jada, by his side, his empire lighting up the world, and the admiration of millions. But Jada, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, had grown weary. She had her own ideas about power, and it wasn't about electricity or Wilcoin. It was about something far more intimate, far more personal. It started small. A few meetings with an old friend. Someone who understood her in ways Will didn't. Someone who didn't need the spotlight to feel validated. Will was too busy changing the world to notice the late nights Jada was spending away from him. After all, how could a man who had practically revolutionized the planet keep an eye on his own home? There were meetings, late-night phone calls, and secret rendezvous. Will never imagined that the woman who had been his rock for so long was slipping away. But she was. And by the time he figured it out, the affair had already begun. At first, Will was oblivious. He had the world at his fingertips. He was the godfather of electricity, the king of innovation, the one who had electrified the very soul of humanity. He was busy, always on the move, always in the spotlight. Who had time for a woman when the world was demanding his attention? Who had time for anything except his empire? But then the whispers started. At first, they were just rumors, small things that didn't make sense. Things that Will brushed off as the nonsense of people who didn't understand the genius behind his empire. People who didn't get that Will Smith was the force behind everything. And the world was lucky to have him. Jada, on the other hand, was the rock. She was his partner, his soulmate, and she wasn't going anywhere. Or so he thought. The truth hit Will like an electric shock, a shock he didn't see coming. He walked in on one of their meetings, a conversation he had no business overhearing. Jada was sitting in their living room, talking to a man who wasn't just a friend. No, this was someone else, someone who made her laugh in a way Will hadn't in months, someone who understood her need for power and control in a way Will never could. He wasn't just sitting on the couch. He was practically enthroned in their living room, and Will saw the way they looked at each other. And in that moment, Will realized something terrible. His electric empire? It wasn't the only thing that could burn down. Jada's affair wasn't the only spark threatening to destroy him. It was the perfect storm. And what Will had created, the dazzling lights, the never-ending party, the empire that seemed too good to be true, was now all falling apart. He stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that his wife had found someone else, or that he hadn't noticed until now. He had built this empire from the ground up, but somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the one thing that truly mattered, the people in his life. And now, his empire wasn't the only thing crumbling. His marriage was too. And as if on cue, the lights in the house flickered. The irony wasn't lost on Will. He had literally built the power grid for the world. But here he was, standing in his own home, powerless. Meanwhile, back in the electric underground, Ethan Sparks was starting to feel the heat of his own revolution. His crew of hackers and rebels was growing, and they were getting bolder. Will's empire was tipping over, and the more people saw Will's personal life unravel, the more they were emboldened to push harder. They didn't just want to take control of the electricity anymore. They wanted to take control of everything. Will's personal failure became their rallying cry. The man who had once been an unstoppable force, Will Smith, the creator of electricity, was now just another man who had lost everything. And his empire? It was just the next casualty in the making. Ethan Sparks was no fool. He knew Will was slipping. He could see the cracks in the electrical grid in the world Will had built, and he was ready to use that to his advantage. The underground was no longer some small-time resistance. It was becoming a full-fledged movement, one that wasn't just about taking down the lights. It was about taking down the very idea of Will Smith and everything he had built. Ethan's followers grew bolder with each blackout. The first one had been a small experiment, taking out a single city grid. But now they were targeting entire regions, whole countries even. Will's empire, once so bright and untouchable, was now flickering at the edges. The blackouts were spreading, and the cracks in the power grid were growing. Will, in the midst of his personal meltdown, was caught in a whirlwind of his own making. He had no idea how to fix the grid, both the literal one and the metaphorical one he'd so carefully constructed. He had too much on his plate. And as Jada continued her affair with her new friend, who was, as it turned out, no stranger to the power of Will's electric empire, Will could feel the weight of his empire pressing down on him. But here's where it gets interesting. In the midst of all the chaos, the electric grid began to do something unexpected. It evolved. No, not because Will had made it smarter, but because the people, the rebels, the underground, the ones who had always been living in the shadows, were learning how to use electricity for themselves. They didn't need Will anymore. They were creating their own power, their own network. They didn't need the king of electricity to light up their lives anymore. Will wasn't just losing control over his empire. He was losing control over everything. And as the lights continued to flicker, Will realized that the empire he had built was not going to be the last thing to burn. It was his marriage, his reputation, his legacy that was about to come crashing down. The same power that had made him the richest man in the world was now the thing that would destroy him. The world had changed, but Will hadn't. He had been shocking people for years. But now, he was the one in need of a wake-up call. And just like that, the rebellion wasn't just on the streets. It was inside his home. The lights? They were flickering for a reason. And Will Smith wasn't sure if they'd ever come back on. Will Smith had always been a man who thrived on control. He had built his empire from scratch, and in doing so, he had convinced the world that he, alone, had the answers to humanity's most pressing questions. How could we power cities? How could we revolutionize life itself? Will Smith had the answers. He had created electricity. He had brought it to the masses, like some modern-day Zeus, wielding lightning not from the heavens, but from his own brilliant mind. The world had embraced him as their genius, their creator, their source of power. And for a while, it felt like everything was perfect. But perfection, like electricity, is a dangerous thing. It was only a matter of time before the lights started to flicker. It all started with the blackouts. The first one had been small, a few power grids going down in a couple of cities. Nothing Will couldn't fix, nothing too serious. But then came the second blackout, and the third. And suddenly, it wasn't just a glitch. It was a pattern. Will, ever the optimist, had brushed it off at first. Maybe it was just a few bad connections, a few rogue electricians messing with the grid. It wasn't until he saw a news report broadcasting live from the very city that had once been a shining example of his genius that he realized the truth. The underground was rising. Ethan Sparks, a name that had once meant nothing, was now everywhere. The electric underground, the rebels who had started with nothing more than a dream and a few misfit hackers, had become an army. Their movement was growing stronger every day, fueled not just by anger, but by the one thing Will had never expected. Hope. Hope that they could take back control. Hope that they could, finally, live in a world where they had the power, not Will Smith. And then there was Jada. Will had always been able to juggle the world, his empire, and his family. But this was something he couldn't handle. She had been his rock, his partner. But now their relationship, once a symbol of Hollywood perfection, was splintering. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal of power. Jada, his wife, the woman who had stood beside him through it all, had found someone else, a man who understood her in ways Will never had. This wasn't just an affair. It was a power shift in the most intimate way possible. Will had spent his entire life creating an empire that ran on his vision, on his genius. But now, the one thing that truly mattered, his family, was slipping through his fingers. His marriage, once the cornerstone of his identity, was crumbling in front of him. The one person who had always been there for him was now walking away, step by step, with someone else. Will had been too busy creating light for the world to see that his own home was sinking into darkness. And the worst part? He couldn't even blame Jada. No. Will had built this empire on the assumption that his charisma, his charm, and his larger-than-life presence would be enough to hold everything together. But it wasn't. The empire had grown so big, so all-encompassing, that there was no room for anything else. There was no room for the people who mattered most. And now, he was alone in a mansion of electricity, with no one to share it with. The revolution wasn't just in the streets, it was in his home. Will could feel the walls closing in on him. The lights, the ones he had brought into the world to bring people together, were now the thing that divided them. The revolution wasn't about overthrowing him, not at first. It was about taking back control. It was about forcing Will Smith to feel the loss, the way everyone else had felt when he took away their ability to choose, their ability to live without his power. Will had made the mistake of thinking he could be both God and man. Now, the very people he had enslaved with his electric empire were rising up against him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ethan Sparks wasn't a genius. He wasn't some tech prodigy with a deep understanding of the intricacies of electricity. But Ethan had one thing Will didn't: perspective. Ethan had spent years watching the world around him, watching as Will's empire grew and grew and grew. He had watched as Will took everything, power, control, wealth, and made it his own. He had seen people, regular people, become nothing more than consumers of Will's vision. They had no say, no control. They were dependent on Will for their very survival. And that wasn't just dangerous, it was wrong. Ethan had started small. A few hack grids here and there. A few blackouts to shake things up, to get people talking. But the more people started to listen, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about electricity. This was about freedom. This was about taking back control. The more Ethan spoke, the more people began to follow him. Not just the desperate, the destitute, but the ones who had everything and were suddenly realizing that having everything meant nothing if you didn't have freedom. The movement grew. The Electric Underground wasn't just a group of hackers anymore. It was an army of people who wanted their power back, not just in the literal sense, but in every sense. They didn't want to be at the mercy of Will's empire anymore. They didn't want to be slaves to the system Will had built. They wanted to live in a world where they could make their own choices, their own decisions, without having to pay for it. And the best part? Ethan had Will's empire figured out. Will had made a fatal mistake. He had created a world so dependent on him, so dependent on his electricity, that it was impossible for him to ever let go. Will's empire couldn't function without him. But Ethan's underground revolution didn't need Will. It didn't need anyone. They had learned to harness the power of the grid, to take back what had been taken from them. They had found ways to steal Will's energy without him knowing. They had created a new world, one that was theirs, not Will's. Will's empire was crumbling in the most unexpected ways. It wasn't the rebellion in the streets that was hurting him. It was the betrayal in his own home. His wife, the woman who had stood by him through the chaos, had fallen in love with someone else. Someone who didn't need the spotlight. Someone who didn't need the fame. And Will, in his obsessive pursuit of power, had neglected the one thing that had mattered most. Jada's affair wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a betrayal of Will's very foundation. She had once been his partner, his equal, the one person who had kept him grounded. But now she was gone, physically and emotionally. And there was nothing Will could do to fix it. He had spent so much time building the future, and in doing so, had lost the present. He had lost the people who truly mattered. And the worst part? Will knew deep down that he couldn't fix it. He couldn't just flip a switch and make things better. No amount of electricity, no amount of power could bring his wife back. No amount of will coin could fix the hole in his heart. The empire was in danger, his marriage was in ruins, and the rebellion, both personal and political, was just beginning. Will had created a world of light, but the darkness was creeping in. And this time, it wasn't something he could control. He had built the future, but the future was about to break him. He could feel the walls closing in, the rebellion, the affair, the loss of control. The question was no longer if he would lose everything. The question was, when? Will Smith sat in his office, the glow from his electric-powered desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The soft hum of the lights around him, once a comforting reminder of his dominance, now felt more like a threat. He stared out the window, watching as the city of Philadelphia shimmered in the night, aglow with the very power he had given it. People down below were living in the world he had created, an electrified utopia, or so he had hoped. The world, however, was far from utopian. The first few blackouts, Will had told himself, were just a few isolated glitches. Sure, the underground had hacked into his systems and caused a few minor disruptions, but nothing too serious. Then the lights went out again and again. More than that, they had started spreading. Entire neighborhoods, cities even, had been hit. Will couldn't ignore the fact anymore. His empire was crumbling, and he couldn't fix it with a flick of a switch. He had spent years building this electric kingdom, a place where everything could run smoothly with the push of a button, where all the power rested in his hands. Will Smith had lit up the world, but now he was powerless. And it wasn't just the electric grid that was in trouble. It was his personal life. Will had ignored the signs, thinking that as long as the light stayed on, as long as the world continued to hum with his power, everything else would fall into place. But he was wrong. Jada, his wife, had pulled away from him in a way he hadn't been able to see. Their marriage, once strong, now felt fragile and distant. Her affair with someone who had no interest in electricity, someone who was present with her in ways Will hadn't been in years, was a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how well lit, could stand without the foundation of genuine connection. Will's mind swirled. What was the point of all this? He had built an empire of light, and yet he felt himself surrounded by darkness. The underground was growing bolder. They were hacking into grids, draining will coin reserves, and cutting off power to entire regions. People were starting to fight back. They weren't just angry anymore, they were empowered. And who had empowered them? Will had, of course. It was his invention that had changed everything. But in doing so, he had given them the power to destroy him. The people Will had once considered his supporters were now his greatest threat. And Jada? She was slipping through his fingers like sand. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that his electric empire, the empire that had once defined him, was collapsing, or the fact that his wife, the one person who had always been by his side, had found solace in someone else. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. How had he gotten here? Across town, Ethan Sparks was sitting in a dark room, illuminated only by the flickering glow of computer screens. The electric underground had grown exponentially in the last few weeks. What had started as a small group of hackers trying to disrupt Will's empire had become a full-scale revolution. People from all walks of life were joining the movement, united by one thing. They were tired of being controlled by Will's monopoly. They wanted freedom. They wanted power, real power, not the kind Will had given them. Ethan was more determined than ever. The underground had figured out how to manipulate the power grids, how to reroute electricity without leaving a trace. Will had made one fatal mistake. He had created a system that ran on dependency. And once people became dependent, once they realized they couldn't function without Will's power, they had become easy targets. Ethan knew that. And now he was exploiting it. The rebellion wasn't just about taking down the lights. It was about reclaiming control. The people, the masses, had been living in Will's shadow for too long. They had been living in a world where their every move, their every choice, had been dictated by electricity. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about freedom. And Ethan was going to give them that freedom. He sat back in his chair, fingers flying over the keyboard as he and his team launched another wave of blackouts. This time, they weren't just disabling a few grids here and there. They were targeting the heart of Will's empire, the central hubs of his power, the ones that connected every city to the electrical grid. If they took those out, they could stop Will from controlling anything. The countdown began. Seconds ticked by. And then, boom, another city went dark. Ethan allowed himself a small smile, but there was no time for celebration. The rebellion had only just begun, and there was much more to do. Back at Will's mansion, he was pacing. The lights flickered again. Another blackout, he thought. He had to admit it. He was losing control. He couldn't fix the grid fast enough. He couldn't stop the underground. And he couldn't fix what was broken at home. Jada hadn't come home the night before. She was spending more and more time with him, her friend, the man who didn't need Will's empire to feel important. Will could feel her slipping away, and there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't just make her feel electric. He couldn't flick a switch and make everything right. And as much as he hated to admit it, there was one other thing that was gnawing at him. The affair wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that, deep down, he didn't blame her. Will had been so consumed by his empire, by the lights, the power, the fame, that he had forgotten the most important thing. Her. He had lost her in the pursuit of power, and that wasn't something you could fix with a flashy invention. Will had created a world where everything was powered by his electricity, but he had neglected the most important thing, his connection to the people around him. He collapsed into the armchair by the window and stared out at the darkening city. The lights were dimming. The world was changing, and Will had no idea what the future would look like. Would the underground win? Would his empire fall? And what would that mean for him? What would it mean for his family? For the first time in a long time, Will Smith felt powerless. Jada, on the other hand, had made her choice. She had spent months torn between the life she had with Will, rich, powerful, electrified, and the life she could have with someone who understood her in ways Will never could. She had watched Will rise, create, and dominate, but she had been left in the shadows. She had stood by him, silently watching as his obsession with his empire took over every aspect of his life. But now, Jada had finally found someone who saw her, who didn't need her to fit into the shiny, picture-perfect world Will had created. She was tired of being just another part of Will's electric empire. She wanted something real. She wanted to feel something. And as much as Will had changed the world with his electric power, Jada was done being another thing he controlled. The affair was her way out, her way of reclaiming herself, of finding her own path. Will wasn't ready to lose everything. Not yet. He wouldn't let it happen. But as he sat in his darkened mansion, the weight of everything bearing down on him, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. His empire was falling, his marriage was crumbling, and the lights were flickering out, both in the world and in his heart. The city of Philadelphia buzzed with energy, a literal hum of progress, as always, thanks to Will Smith's invention. The streets were alive with lights. The houses, tall and magnificent, flickered with the brilliance of Will's empire. There was no part of this city, no part of the modern world, untouched by his influence. From the hum of the lights on the corner to the continuous, unyielding power that fueled businesses and homes alike, everything had been touched by the flick of Will's switch. And yet, the same lights that powered his empire now cast long, haunting shadows over his life. Will had always been the man in control. His charisma, his presence, he made people feel like anything was possible. He gave the world electricity, sure, but what he truly gave them was a feeling that their lives could be bigger, brighter, more electric. And for a while they were. People were living in his world, surrounded by a constant glow of possibility. But now, as the power flickered in the streets, as the cracks began to show in his empire, it was clear. Will Smith wasn't the man who had everything under control anymore. He stood in front of his vast, imposing mansion, staring at the city through his penthouse windows. Outside, the world shimmered with the artificial lights of his own making. But inside, Will felt the creeping darkness. The underground movement, led by Ethan Sparks, was gaining momentum. It was no longer a small band of hackers and dissidents. It was a full-scale revolution. People were starting to rise up. They were tired of living in Will's electrically charged world, where their every need, every want, was controlled by his invention. Will had built a prison disguised as a paradise, and now the inmates were rebelling. It wasn't just the rebellion that had him trapped. It was his marriage, or, rather, the death of it. Will had ignored the warning signs for too long, thinking that as long as his empire stood, everything else would follow. But Jada had found someone else. Someone who didn't need to be powered by Will's energy to feel alive. Someone who didn't need to feel the glow of fame, power, or wealth to make her world light up. Will's mind kept circling back to that one moment when everything had shattered. The moment when he had walked in on Jada with her new lover. He had been blind, truly. The affair had been building for months, maybe longer. And what hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that he had been so focused on his empire, on turning the world into a playground of light and power, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered. Jada, his partner, his equal. She had always been the constant in his life. And now she was slipping away, and there was nothing Will could do about it. No amount of electricity, no amount of Will coins could bring her back. The power that had once fueled him, that had fueled the world, now seemed like a cheap trick, a hollow victory. His empire was a fragile house of cards, and the moment he turned his attention away from it, it had started to fall apart. He had built something monumental, something that would go down in history, but at what cost? What good was an empire that could light up the world, but couldn't keep the lights on in his own home? Will sank into the chair by his window, staring out at the city, the hum of his empire buzzing around him. His thoughts raced. The underground was making moves, pushing harder with each blackout, each power surge, each moment of weakness. It wasn't just small hackers causing trouble anymore. The rebellion was gaining strength. People were waking up. They realized that Will's invention had given them power, but it had also given them control. And once you take control from the people, you've sealed your fate. Across town, Ethan Sparks was watching it all unfold. The electric grid flickered and surged as another blackout hit. His team of rebels had taken out yet another hub, another critical power source in Will's empire. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching the chaos ripple through the news. People were starting to notice now. People were talking. The movement was spreading faster than he could have ever imagined. And the best part? They weren't just fighting for power. They were fighting for their right to exist in a world where they weren't controlled by one man's vision. They wanted a world where they could make their own choices, live on their own terms, and, most importantly, have the freedom to choose how to use power. Ethan had never cared for the fame, the glitz, the glamour. Will Smith had created a world of excess, and people had become addicted to it. But the rebellion? That was real. People were fighting back, not because they hated electricity, but because they hated the way Will had monopolized it. They were fighting for their autonomy, their ability to choose. And Ethan Sparks? He was the one leading them. But even as the underground grew in strength, Ethan knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Will wasn't just some nameless, faceless billionaire. He was Will Smith, a man who had turned an entire planet into his electric playground. A man who had built an empire of light and power. The revolution wasn't just about taking down a man. It was about taking down everything he had built. And Ethan wasn't sure the world was ready for what would come next. Will's empire had grown too large, too powerful, too dependent. And now there was no going back. As the rebellion gained ground, Will found himself increasingly isolated. He was cut off from his allies, from his family, and worst of all, from a thing that had always kept him grounded, his sense of self. Will Smith, once the man who electrified the world, now found himself powerless. The underground was systematically taking down his grid piece by piece, as if they were dismantling the very foundation of his identity. But worse, the whispers had started. The rumors. People were talking about how Will had lost touch, how his marriage had fallen apart, how he had neglected the people who mattered most, both in his personal life and in his empire. The media, once his greatest ally, was now turning on him, eager to write his downfall as the greatest story of all. But there was one thing Will couldn't shake: the fact that Jada, the woman he had built this empire for, had left him. She had found someone else, someone who wasn't part of his world, someone who didn't need to be plugged into his electrical grid to feel whole. And in that moment, Will realized what he had truly lost. Jada had always been the stabilizing force in his life. She had been his partner in both marriage and business. But somewhere along the way, Will had gotten lost in the power, in the fame, in the lights. She had been left in the dark, her needs, her desires, her humanity, overshadowed by his obsession with bigger, better, brighter. Will knew he had made a mistake, a fatal mistake, and now he was paying for it in ways he hadn't imagined. He had built a world of power and light, but he had ignored the one thing that could keep it all from crumbling. And as he sat there in his mansion, surrounded by the very empire he had created, Will Smith finally understood the price of his success. The question wasn't whether he could fix it. The question was, could he even survive it? Outside, the lights flickered once more, a sharp reminder that nothing lasts forever, not even Will Smith's electric empire. And as Will stared out at the city, he realized something that stung harder than any blackout. He had built this world. He had changed everything. But now, it was slipping through his fingers. As the rebellion grew stronger, and the underground movement threatened to topple everything Will had worked for, he had to ask himself, what was the point of it all? He had been the king of electricity. But now, he was just another man in the dark. And the worst part? He had no idea how to turn the lights back on. The world, once lit by Will Smith's vision of electric brilliance, was now descending into darkness, but not the kind Will had predicted. The kind of darkness where shadows of his past decisions stretched long and wide, eclipsing the very empire he had worked so tirelessly to build. He sat in his massive, once vibrant mansion, now too quiet, too cold. His electric lights flickered intermittently, mocking him as if the world itself was rebelling against him. There was no warmth to be found in the glow of his empire anymore. The hum of power that had once been a constant source of comfort now sounded like the distant, inevitable thrum of a heartbeat slowing down. Will had built an empire that ran on power, and now he was discovering what it was like to feel powerless. In the beginning, it had been about the rush, the invention, the chaos, the intoxicating feel of knowing he could light up entire cities with a single thought, make the world run at his command. But now, the weight of it all was bearing down on him. His marriage had disintegrated. His wife, Jada, had slipped away into the arms of someone else, and Will could do nothing but watch as his world crumbled around him. He had known the consequences of neglecting the small things. He had built an empire after all. But what he hadn't anticipated was how much the world would begin to hate him for it. And now the underground, led by Ethan Sparks, was taking full advantage of his mistakes. What had started as a handful of hackers trying to disrupt his carefully constructed grid had evolved into a full-scale movement, a revolution that threatened not just the electric power that Will had so carefully distributed, but the very foundation of the world he had envisioned. Ethan Sparks was no longer just a rogue tech geek. It was clear that he had become the leader of something far more dangerous. The rebellion wasn't about fighting for power anymore. It was about fighting for freedom. And the underground's rallying cry was loud and clear. No one man should hold the power of the world. They had learned to bypass Will's grid, to siphon energy, to take what they needed, and they were growing stronger by the day. Will had once seen himself as the only person capable of holding such immense power, but now it was evident that the world was beginning to take matters into their own hands. They had realized the truth that Will had ignored for too long. The power Will had created was a dangerous drug, and when the masses got a taste of it, they wanted more. And Jada? She was no longer the rock he could cling to. She had found someone else, Someone who didn't need to be bathed in the glory of fame or power to feel whole. Jada had sought solace in another's arms, and Will couldn't help but wonder if it was because he had abandoned her in the pursuit of greatness. He had been so focused on lighting up the world that he had lost the one person who truly mattered. Will had poured everything into his empire, his time, his energy, his soul, and in the end, it had cost him his family. Jada had fallen in love with someone who had no interest in the electric empire Will had built. She was tired of living in his shadow. She had no desire to be a part of his world anymore, and it wasn't just about the affair. It was about the fact that Will hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. She had wanted connection, something Will had thought he could replace with power. But no amount of electric lights could fill the emptiness that had been left behind in his absence. As the underground grew bolder, Ethan's plans were becoming more than just the occasional blackout. They were targeting critical points in Will's infrastructure, taking out entire sectors of the grid, and Will had no way of stopping them. His once glorious empire was crumbling, one power surge at a time, and the rebellion was picking up speed. The blackouts were getting larger, the power surges more frequent, and people were starting to see the cracks in Will's perfect world. For the first time since he had invented electricity, Will felt as though he was losing control. Ethan Sparks wasn't just fighting to take down Will's electric grid. Ethan was fighting for something much deeper, something that threatened Will's very existence. Ethan had become a symbol of rebellion, a hero to those who had been living in the shadows of Will's empire. The people were waking up, realizing that they had been living in a world that was not their world, but Will's. And Will's world was about to collapse. He sat back in his chair, his head spinning. The weight of the situation was almost too much to bear. He had been so focused on being the hero, the genius who had brought light to the world, that he hadn't seen the inevitable fallout. Now, the world was starting to reject him. His wife had left him. His empire was falling. The rebellion was gaining power. He was starting to lose everything that had ever mattered to him. And to make matters worse, his own invention, the very thing that had made him the king of this electric world, was now the thing that was going to destroy him. It was too late to turn back now. The underground had gained too much power, and Will was struggling to keep up. The grid was beginning to collapse under the pressure of the blackouts, the sabotage, and the growing rebellion. People were beginning to question the very system that Will had built. They were questioning him. Will couldn't stop them. He couldn't keep the power flowing. He couldn't fix the mess he had created. All his control had slipped away. The rebellion was no longer just about fighting for power. It was about reclaiming their lives. And Will was the symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. The one man who had once held all the power was now the most hated man on the planet. And Jada? She was gone. Will had tried to fix everything, to make it right, but now, he realized too late that some things couldn't be fixed. He had lost her. He had lost his empire. He had lost his place in the world. The underground movement wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of Will's electric empire. Freedom from the suffocating control he had placed on the world. Will had been so consumed with his creation that he had never once stopped to consider what it meant to let go. And now, in the silence of his crumbling empire, Will understood that it was too late. Ethan Sparks had won. The rebellion had won. And Will Smith, once the god of electricity, the king of power, was now nothing more than a man in the dark, with nothing left to hold on to. His electric empire had lit up the world, but it had also burned him alive. The lights were going out, and Will couldn't stop them. His kingdom was crumbling. His marriage was gone. And all he had left was the slow, inevitable hum of power flickering, and then silence. The storm had arrived, and Will Smith had no idea how to survive it. Will Smith's empire was crumbling, and the realization hit him with the force of a lightning strike, one that, ironically, he could no longer control. The city outside his mansion, once a gleaming testament to his brilliance, now felt like a lifeless shell. The lights flickered ominously in the streets, a grim reminder of the rebellion that was eating away at the foundation of everything he had built. People had always been so dependent on his empire. The endless streams of electricity, the electric cars, the glowing skyscrapers, the endless luxury. But that reliance had become a trap. Will had made the world dependent on his brilliance. And in doing so, he had created a perfect storm. A storm that was now coming for him. It wasn't just the blackouts, the sudden surges of power, the riots that were starting to spread through the streets. It wasn't just the sabotage of his electric grid. No, the real threat was more insidious, more personal. Will had lost himself in the rush to power the world, to shine in every corner of the globe. And now, as the lights flickered and the world descended into chaos, he was faced with the undeniable truth. He had sacrificed everything for a world that was now slipping through his fingers. The rebellion was no longer just a group of hackers and dissidents. It was a full-scale revolution, and Ethan Sparks was its leader. Ethan wasn't some anarchist driven by hatred of Will. No, Ethan had a plan. Ethan wasn't just trying to take down an empire. He was trying to create a new world. One where power wasn't controlled by a single individual. One where people had the freedom to live without relying on someone like Will Smith to light their way. And the worst part was, Ethan was winning. Will's control over the electrical grid was faltering. The underground had taken down critical points of the system, and now entire regions were without power. The more Ethan pushed, the more the world rallied behind him. What had started as a small resistance was now a movement with real momentum. And people were starting to wake up to the fact that the world didn't need Will Smith anymore. The lights were going out, both literally and metaphorically. And as they did, Will realized that the very thing he had fought so hard to create, this perfect, electrified world, was now his prison. It was too late to turn back now. He had built this empire from nothing, but in the process, he had lost sight of everything that truly mattered. His family, his marriage, and his connection to the world he had claimed to improve. And Jada? She was gone. Will couldn't even bring himself to call it an affair anymore. She had fallen in love with someone else, someone who wasn't attached to this empire, someone who could see her, really see her, in ways Will hadn't in years. The walls in his mansion had become suffocating. It wasn't just the electrical grid that was failing, it was his marriage, his connection to Jada, to the people who had supported him. In the pursuit of greatness, Will had neglected the very thing that had once grounded him. And now, Jada had left, not just physically, but emotionally. She had found someone who could give her what Will had no longer been able to provide, connection. Will had thought his empire was enough. He had built a world of lights, a world of power, of endless possibility. But in doing so, he had ignored the very foundation that kept him standing. The people who mattered most to him. And now, as he sat in the shadows of his own creation, Will was faced with the cold, harsh truth. The world had moved on without him. The rebellion wasn't just a reaction to his control. It was a response to everything he had failed to see. People didn't want to be part of his world anymore. They didn't want to live in a world where one man had control over everything. They wanted something real, something human. And that was something Will had lost long ago. Will's mind was reeling, racing from one thought to another. The underground had learned to hack into his systems, to use his own invention against him. What had once been the greatest gift to humanity had now become a tool for revolution. And Ethan Sparks, with his band of rebels, was leading the charge. But the worst part? Will couldn't even blame them. How could he? They were right. He had built a world where everything was powered by his name, by his vision. But in doing so, he had created a world that was too dependent on him. And when the world began to realize they didn't need him anymore, they had begun to rise up against him. Will was standing in the ruins of his empire, watching as everything he had worked for crumbled away. The rebellion wasn't just about taking control of the power grid anymore. It was about taking back their freedom. And as he watched the protests and the riots begin to escalate, Will knew that the time for him to act was running out. He could feel the walls closing in, and for the first time in a long time, Will wasn't sure what the next step was. He had always been the man with the plan, the one who knew what to do. But now he was just a man with a broken empire, a shattered marriage, and a world that was slipping further and further out of his control. The underground wasn't just about hacking the power grid. It was about freedom. They wanted a world where electricity wasn't controlled by one man's will, where they didn't have to pay for the right to exist in a world lit up by Will's genius. They wanted a world where they didn't have to be slaves to the system Will had created. And now, as the rebellion continued to spread, Will had to ask himself, was he the hero, or was he the villain? His invention had started out as a blessing. It had been his vision, his genius, that had changed the world. But now, it was clear that it had become a curse. People were tired of living in Will's world, and the moment they realized they had the power to take back control, they did. They didn't need Will. They didn't need his empire. They didn't need his electricity. And as Will sat there in his mansion, the weight of everything crashing down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was already moving on. He had made a fatal mistake. He had thought that by controlling the world's power, he could control the world itself. But in the end, he had lost everything. His marriage, his empire, his place in the world. And no amount of electricity, no amount of Will coin could fix what had been broken. It wasn't just the rebellion that was eating away at his empire. It was his own decisions. His obsession with power, with control, with greatness, had cost him everything. And now, as the lights flickered and the rebellion raged outside, Will Smith was left in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The empire he had built was gone, and so was his place in the world. He had been the one to bring light to the world. But now, as the rebellion gained ground, it was clear that he had been the one to blind them. And the world wasn't looking back. Will Smith was no longer the hero. He was the cautionary tale. The world outside Will Smith's mansion buzzed with unrest, the flickering lights a symbol of what had once been and now was falling apart. The chaos, the blackouts, the protests, they were no longer just whispers in the streets. They were a living, breathing force that couldn't be ignored. Will had built an empire based on electricity, and now, as his world turned dimmer by the day, it felt as if the very energy he had harnessed was slipping through his fingers. His empire, once as bright as the city lights he had powered, now seemed to darken with every passing minute. Every protester, every dissenter, every hacker who broke into his systems was a reminder that what he had created was no longer in his control. And that was something Will couldn't stand. His genius had been the light that powered the world, the one thing he could control in a universe he couldn't. But now his empire was crumbling, and his genius had turned on him. Like a power surge no one had prepared for, Will stood in his office, staring at the sprawling city below. The once great city of Philadelphia, the first to feel the brilliance of his invention, now seemed like a ghost town. The lights were dimming, the hum of electricity fading. His creation, his legacy, was under siege, and he had no idea how to stop it. He had tried to fix the power grid, tried to restore the control he once had. But the truth was clear now. The underground, led by Ethan Sparks, had won. Will had underestimated the power of a rebellion fueled by freedom. He had underestimated the people. And worse, he had underestimated himself. He had thought that by controlling the world's electricity, he would control the world itself. He had thought that by being the source of power, he would be the source of everything. But now, as the lights flickered and the people rioted, Will realized the fundamental flaw in his thinking. Power wasn't just about control, it was about trust. And the people didn't trust him anymore. They didn't trust the system he had built. Will had spent so long in the spotlight, in the glow of his empire, that he had lost sight of the most basic truth. The world didn't need him. They didn't need his lights, his power, or his will coin. They needed something real. Something that didn't run on the wires and circuits he had created. And Jada had left him. His partner, the woman who had stood by his side, had found solace in someone else. Will had created a world of power, a world of light, but he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered. Her. And now she was gone. She had found someone who didn't need his empire to feel alive. Someone who could see her in a way Will never had. And that was the most painful part. Because Will hadn't just lost Jada. He had lost himself. The man who had once been the creator of worlds, the man who had brought light to the planet, was now standing in the dark. Will's mind raced. He couldn't keep up with the underground's pace anymore. They were too fast, too smart, and the grid, his precious grid, was too unstable. They had learned to hack into his systems, to manipulate his technology, and they were doing it better than he ever could. The blackouts were no longer isolated incidents. They were calculated. They were strategic. And each blackout felt like a punch in the gut. He wasn't just losing control of the grid. He was losing control of the world. The power was no longer in his hands. Ethan Sparks and the underground were now the ones calling the shots. Will couldn't ignore it anymore. He was a man who had been used to being in control. But now he was powerless. And it wasn't just the rebellion that had him reeling. It was the collapse of his empire, the collapse of the very system he had built. He had created a world that ran on electricity, but in the process, he had created a world that was too dependent on him. And now, as the lights flickered and the rebellion grew stronger, Will realized that his empire wasn't just crumbling because of the underground. It was crumbling because he had built it wrong. He had thought that by controlling the power, he could control everything. But power wasn't about control. It was about trust. And now, as his empire spiraled into chaos, he couldn't help but wonder, what had it all been for? The lights, the power, the billions of dollars. What was the point if the people didn't trust you? If the people didn't need you? It was too late to undo what he had done. The underground had already spread too far. The rebellion had taken on a life of its own. People were waking up. They were realizing that they didn't need Will's empire anymore. They didn't need the lights, the power, the control. They just needed the freedom to live without it. Will sat back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. He had built this empire from the ground up. He had created a world where power was his to command. But now, the very thing he had created was the thing that would destroy him. The blackouts, the surges, the rebellion, and Jada, his marriage, his family, everything had slipped through his fingers. And now, with the lights dimming and his empire crumbling, Will was left to wonder if it was all worth it. He had once been the creator of worlds, the man who could light up the world with a snap of his fingers. But now he was just a man in the dark, wondering how it had all gone wrong. Will's empire had lit up the world. But now, as the lights flickered and the rebellion spread, it seemed that the world was no longer willing to be his. The underground had taken control. The people had taken control. And Will Smith was just a man in the dark, with nothing left to hold on to. His empire had once been his greatest achievement. But now, it was his greatest failure. The world had changed, and Will was no longer the one who could change it. The people had moved on. The lights had gone out, and there was nothing Will could do to turn them back on. Will Smith could feel the world slipping through his fingers like water. The buzzing hum of electricity, once a comforting sound, now felt suffocating, like a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. His empire, built on the very foundation of light and power, was collapsing piece by piece. The underground had outsmarted him at every turn, exploiting the weaknesses in his carefully constructed system, and now, as the rebellion grew, it felt as if his world, his perfect world, was crumbling into dust. The lights outside his mansion flickered again, a cruel reminder of the havoc Ethan Sparks and his rebels were wreaking on the grid. The blackouts were spreading, the surges growing more frequent, and Will couldn't seem to stop it. It had all been so easy at first. He had created the electric world, the global empire that everyone depended on, the system that ran everything from streetlights to factories to homes. Will had made electricity accessible to every corner of the earth, and in doing so, he had become the most powerful man alive. But now, power no longer rested in his hands. It was slipping away, and no amount of technology, no amount of Will coins could fix it. The rebellion had exposed a fatal flaw in Will's empire. The people had become too dependent on him. And once you give people power, once you give them the ability to choose, it becomes impossible to control them. Ethan Sparks had tapped into that. He had tapped into the very thing that Will had ignored, The idea that no one should be held hostage by one man's creation. People were fighting back, and Will, for the first time in his life, didn't know how to fight back himself. He wasn't just fighting a revolution. He was fighting the very existence of his empire. And that wasn't a battle you could win by flicking a switch. Will sank into the chair by his desk, staring at the city beyond his windows, a city he had once illuminated with his genius. Now it seemed to be fading, a ghost of what it once was. He could see the rebellion growing, people marching through the streets with banners calling for freedom. It wasn't just about taking down Will's empire anymore. It was about reclaiming their lives, their freedom, their autonomy. And it wasn't just happening in the streets. It was happening in his own home. Jada, his wife, the woman he had loved for so long, was gone. She had left him, and it wasn't just because of the affair. It was because Will had built an empire so big, so all-encompassing, that he had lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered. Her. Their marriage had faltered long before she had found solace in another man's arms. Will had been so consumed with his vision, with his empire, that he had neglected everything else. And now, as the lights flickered and the rebellion grew stronger, Will realized that his world had never been as perfect as he thought. Jada wasn't the only thing he had lost. He had lost himself. The man who had once been the king of the world, the creator of electricity, now found himself powerless. The empire he had built was crumbling. The people he had once helped were rising up against him. And all the while his marriage, his personal life, was slipping away. Will sat there in his chair, staring out at the city, his mind racing, his heart heavy. He had always been the one who controlled the world's power. But now he was nothing more than a spectator in his own downfall. He had created a world of light, but now he was living in the dark. The rebellion was no longer just a distant threat. It was knocking at his door, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Will had always been the hero, the man who changed the world. But now he was the villain in his own story. He had created an empire, but he had never considered the cost. He had never considered what would happen when the people realized they didn't need him anymore. Ethan Sparks and the underground had awakened something in the world that Will hadn't anticipated. The desire for true freedom. The desire to live without being controlled by one man's creation. Will had been the one to bring light to the world. But now, as the lights flickered and the rebellion raged, it felt like that same light was turning against him. The people were rising up, and Will was starting to realize that his empire wasn't just about electricity. It was about control. And once the people had tasted freedom, they weren't going to let it go. It was only a matter of time before they tore everything down, piece by piece. Will thought about his past, the way he had been hailed as the genius who had revolutionized the world. He had been the one who had brought light to the world, who had created a future that no one had ever dreamed of. But now, as the rebellion grew stronger, he realized that he had been blinded by his own brilliance. He had thought that he could control the world. He had thought that he could create a perfect system. But the truth was, no system could ever be perfect. No empire could ever last forever. And no one man should ever hold all the power. Will thought about Jada, about the life they had built together. The empire had consumed them both. It had consumed everything that had once been good and pure in their relationship. And now she was gone. She had found someone else, a man who didn't need to control the world, a man who didn't need to be the center of attention, a man who could give her what she needed without all the power, all the lights, all the control. And Will realize something that stung more than any blackout ever could. He had lost her. He had lost everything. He had built a world of power and light, but in doing so, he had forgotten what it meant to have a real connection. The people, the ones who had once looked up to him as a god, were now tearing down his empire. And Jada, the woman who had once been his equal, had found a way out. Will's empire was crumbling. The rebellion was winning. And Will Smith? He was just a man in the dark. His lights were out, his empire was gone, and the world had moved on without him. The question now wasn't whether the underground would take control. It was when. Will had built the future, but now it seemed like the future was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. He had given the world everything. But now, the world was taking it back. And there was nothing Will could do to stop it. The city of Philadelphia, once glowing with the light of Will Smith's empire, now felt like a shell of its former self. The electric hum that powered the streets and buildings was no longer a comforting sound. It was a constant reminder that everything was falling apart. Will Smith, once hailed as the most powerful man in the world, the creator of an empire that ran on his invention, was now on the edge of losing everything. His electric grid, once the envy of every country on earth, was crumbling. The underground, led by Ethan Sparks, had become a powerful force, slowly chipping away at the foundation of his empire. Every blackout, every hack, was a small victory for the rebels who had learned to survive without Will's power. But it wasn't just the rebellion that was eating away at Will's world. It was the fallout in his own home, in his personal life, that was proving to be his greatest downfall. Jada, his wife, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, had left him. She had found someone else, a man who didn't need the power, who didn't need the lights to feel complete. Will had neglected her, just as he had neglected the world. His obsession with control, with being the center of everything, had cost him the one person who had always been there for him. And now, as his empire began to fall apart, Will was forced to confront the reality that he had lost everything that had truly mattered. But even in his personal life, there were no easy answers. Will's son Jaden had once been the golden child, the prodigy who had followed in his father's footsteps, playing the role of the next big thing in Hollywood. The Karate Kid remake had been his big break, and for a while, it seemed like Jaden was destined for greatness. The film had been a hit, and Jaden had all the makings of a star. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Jaden wasn't the same bright-eyed, ambitious kid he had once been. He had grown distant, his once promising career now an afterthought. Will had watched his son struggle, and while he had always tried to be supportive, he couldn't help but feel like a failure. The empire he had built, the lights he had created, were no longer enough to protect his family. Jaden had fallen from grace. His acting career, which had once seemed so promising, had dwindled into irrelevance. He had made a name for himself, but it hadn't been the name Will had imagined. It wasn't the name that had lit up the world. And now, as Will stood in the dimly lit hallway of his mansion, staring at the family portraits that adorned the walls, he couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone wrong. His son, the kid who had been the next big thing, had faded into obscurity. The world had moved on, and Jaden had been left behind. And it wasn't just his career that was in freefall, it was his entire life. The strange look on Jaden's face when he had come to visit Will earlier that week still haunted him. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke volumes without saying a word. It was a look of confusion, of disappointment, of a deep, aching emptiness that Will couldn't ignore. It wasn't the look of a child proud of his father. It wasn't the look of a son who had felt the support and guidance he needed. No, it was a look of someone who had been let down, someone who had seen his father's empire crumble, his family fall apart, and who had been forced to deal with the fallout in his own way. Will couldn't help but feel responsible for his son's fall. Jaden had once been on top of the world, and now he was a shell of his former self. And Will knew it was his fault. He had been so consumed with his own success, his own empire, that he had neglected the one thing that should have mattered most, his family. He had thought that his empire, his success, would be enough to protect them. But it wasn't. And now, as Will stood there, alone in the darkness, he realized that it had never been about the lights or the power. It had been about the people. It had been about Jaden. And he had failed him. The power he had given the world, the very power he had once thought was the key to his success, had become the very thing that destroyed him. He had thought that he could control the world, that he could build a better future. But in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. His marriage, his empire, and now his son. Will had been so focused on the lights that he had forgotten to look beyond them. He had built a world where everything was powered by electricity, where people were dependent on him. But in the process, he had built a world where nothing was real. The lights, the power, the fame, it was all a facade. And now, As the lights flickered outside his mansion, Will Smith was left in the dark. His empire was crumbling. His family was falling apart. And there was no turning back. He had created a world where everything was powered by his genius. But now, it was clear that his genius wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. Jaden's fall from grace was just the latest reminder of how far Will had fallen from the man he once was. The Karate Kid, the young prodigy, the next big thing, had faded into obscurity, just like Will's once unstoppable empire. It wasn't just the rebellion that was taking down his empire. It was his own neglect, his own blindness to what truly mattered. The empire he had built, the lights he had created, had never been enough. They had never been real. And now, as the rebellion grew stronger, as the lights began to flicker and die, Will Smith realized that he was the one who had made it all happen. He was the one who had built a world that couldn't stand on its own. A world that had no foundation other than his own brilliance. And now, it was collapsing around him. Will had once been the king of the world, the creator of electricity, the man who could make the world shine. But now, he was just a man lost in the dark, surrounded by the remnants of a world that no longer wanted him. His empire had failed. His marriage had failed. And now, his son, the one person who had once looked up to him, was gone. Will had given the world everything. But the one thing he had failed to give was the one thing that truly mattered. And now, as the lights dimmed and the rebellion raged, Will realized that the cost of his empire had been too high. It had cost him everything. His family, his legacy. And now, the world was moving on without him. Will Smith had once been the creator of worlds. But now he was just another man, lost in the dark, wondering where it had all gone wrong. Will Smith stood at the edge of his vast, once pristine mansion, watching the night fall over a city that had once been his greatest achievement. The gleaming lights of Philadelphia, which he had made possible with his invention, now flickered in a cruel mockery of everything he had once held dear. The streets, once buzzing with the hum of his electric empire, now felt eerily silent, like a place that had lost its soul. Will felt the weight of it all. The weight of his failure pressing down on him, suffocating him. The underground had done what he thought was impossible. They had torn through his empire, one power grid at a time. The once unshakable empire he had built was crumbling, and Will Smith was powerless to stop it. He had always been the one in control, the one who held the power, the one who had the answers. He had given the world light, energy, and the promise of a future that ran on his brilliance. But now he was left in the dark, unable to even fix the lights in his own home. The rebellion, led by Ethan Sparks, had become more than just a nuisance. It had become a full-scale revolution. The people were rising up against the very system that Will had built, and they were taking it down piece by piece. They had learned to manipulate the grid, to hack into his systems, to take control of the very thing he had spent his life perfecting. Will had underestimated them, thinking that his genius would be enough to keep them at bay. But now, as the lights flickered and his empire fell into chaos, he realized that he had made a fatal mistake. He had built a world of power and light, but he had never considered the cost of that power. The people had become dependent on him, and once they had tasted freedom, once they had realized they didn't need him to survive, they had risen up. Ethan Sparks, with his band of rebels, had turned the tide. They were no longer just fighting for control of the electric grid. They were fighting for their freedom. And in the process, they had stripped Will of his. Will had built the grid, the empire, the system that powered the world. But now, that very system had become his greatest enemy. As the blackout spread, as entire cities were plunged into darkness, Will felt a growing sense of despair. The rebellion wasn't just taking down his grid, it was taking down him. His empire, his creation, was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His once unstoppable empire, the one he had built with his own hands, was now on the brink of collapse. And the worst part? Will wasn't sure if he even cared anymore. It wasn't just the empire that had broken him. It was his own failure to see what was happening to his family. The chaos of the rebellion, the collapse of his empire, had all happened so fast. It had been so easy to ignore the cracks in his personal life when he was focused on his empire. He had been so consumed by the power, the control, the lights, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, his family. And now Jada was gone. She had left him, and there was no amount of electricity, no amount of will coin that could bring her back. Jada had found someone else, someone who didn't need the lights to shine. Will had built a world that ran on electricity. But in doing so, he had lost the very thing that had once made him human. Love, connection, family. His son, Jaden, once the golden child, once the Karate Kid, now felt like a stranger to him. Jaden had once been the heir to Will's throne, the next big thing, the one who would carry on the legacy. But now, Jaden was just another casualty of Will's obsession. The strange look in Jaden's eyes, the hollow expression he had worn when he had come to visit Will, still haunted him. Jaden had once looked up to him, had once admired him, but now, Will could see the disappointment in his son's eyes. Jaden wasn't the child he had been. He had fallen from grace, from the heights of stardom, and now his once promising career had withered into obscurity. Will had wanted Jaden to be the next big star, the next big thing, just like he had wanted the world to see his empire as the pinnacle of human achievement. But now, Jaden was just another broken piece of the empire Will had built. The Karate Kid was no longer the shining star of Hollywood. He was just a reminder of how far Will had fallen. And the worst part? Will wasn't sure how to fix it. His empire was crumbling, his marriage was in tatters, and his son was lost to him. He had no control over any of it. He had spent so long building his empire, so long chasing after the next big thing, that he had forgotten the most basic truth of all. Power isn't everything. He had thought that if he built a world that ran on electricity, if he lit up the world, that he would somehow be able to light up his life too. But the lights had gone out in his home. They had gone out in his heart. And now, as the rebellion raged outside his doors, Will couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to turn them back on. The underground, led by Ethan Sparks, was gaining momentum, and Will was no longer in control. The lights in the city were going out one by one, and there was nothing Will could do to stop it. He had created a world where people were dependent on his power, but now they were taking that power back. And Will was just standing in the dark, watching it all slip away. It wasn't just the rebellion that had destroyed his empire. It was his own arrogance, his own inability to see the cracks in the world he had built. He had thought that by giving the world light, he would be giving them everything. But he had neglected the one thing that had mattered most: his family, his relationships, the very things that gave life meaning. Will Smith had been the king of the world, the creator of the future. But now, he was a man in the dark. The lights were going out, and so was everything he had built. And the worst part? He couldn't stop it. The rebellion had already won. Will Smith's empire had fallen. And in the end, there was nothing left but the darkness. Got it. I see you're looking for a more direct, engaging call to action that ties seamlessly into the story's tone without disrupting the flow. Let's rework it into a CTA that feels natural, encourages engagement, and fits the narrative. Here's a refined version of the section. Will Smith stood at the edge of his vast, once pristine mansion, watching the night fall over a city that had once been his greatest achievement. The gleaming lights of Philadelphia, which he had made possible with his invention, now flickered in a cruel mockery of everything he had once held dear. The streets, once buzzing with the hum of his electric empire, now felt eerily silent, like a place that had lost its soul. Will felt the weight of it all, the weight of his failure pressing down on him, suffocating him. The underground had done what he thought was impossible. They had torn through his empire, one power grid at a time. The once unshakable empire he had built was crumbling, and Will Smith was powerless to stop it. He had always been the one in control, the one who made things happen, who could turn his ideas into gold. His invention of electricity had made him the king of the world, the man who had brought light to the darkness. But now, as the rebellion grew stronger and the blackouts spread further, Will realized that he had built his empire on a foundation of sand. The underground, led by Ethan Sparks, had exposed the cracks in his perfect world. The people had learned to survive without him, to live without the constant hum of his empire in the background. Will had given them power, but now that power had been turned against him. The very people who had once relied on him were now the ones rising up, fighting to take back control. Will had built his empire by making people dependent on him. He had thought that by controlling the power, he could control the world. But he had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the people. He had underestimated the desire for freedom, the need for autonomy. The underground had become a symbol of that freedom, a movement that threatened to tear down everything Will had created. And he couldn't stop it. Every attempt to regain control was met with resistance. The blackouts continued, spreading to more cities, more regions. The power grid that Will had spent so long perfecting was now being dismantled piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ethan Sparks and his team of rebels had figured out how to hack into the grid, how to bypass Will's systems, and now they were using his own invention against him. It was ironic, in a way. Will had built an empire on the idea that electricity was the key to a brighter future, to a better world. But now, that very electricity was the thing that was causing his downfall. It wasn't just the rebellion that had Will feeling powerless. It was his own failure to see the bigger picture. His obsession with control, with power, had blinded him to the people around him. He had spent so much time building his empire that he had neglected everything else. Jada, his wife, had left him. She had found someone else, someone who didn't need the lights to shine. Will had built a world of power and light, but in doing so, he had forgotten the most important thing, human connection. And now, as the lights flickered and the rebellion grew stronger, Will realized that his world had never been as perfect as he thought. Jada wasn't the only thing he had lost. He had lost himself. The man who had once been the king of the world, the creator of electricity, now found himself powerless. The empire he had built was crumbling. The people he had once helped were rising up against him. And all the while his marriage, his personal life, was slipping away. Will sat there in his chair, staring out at the city, his mind racing, his heart heavy. He had always been the one who controlled the world's power. But now he was nothing more than a spectator in his own downfall. He had created this world, this empire of light, but now it was slipping away. And it wasn't just the rebellion that had him trapped. It was the realization that he had lost everything that truly mattered. He had lost Jada, the woman who had once stood by his side. He had lost his son, Jaden, who had once looked up to him as a hero, only to fall from grace. And now, as the lights flickered and the world outside his mansion descended into chaos, Will Smith was left alone, unsure of what the future held. His empire was in ruins, and he couldn't fix it. There was no way to turn back time, no way to undo the mistakes he had made. His obsession with power, with control, had cost him everything. And now, the people who had once looked up to him for guidance were the ones taking back control. Will had built a world that ran on his power, but now it was clear that the people had found their own power. They had learned to survive without him. The lights were going out, and Will was powerless to stop it. But what was more terrifying than the blackouts, more terrifying than the rebellion, was the fact that he had no idea what came next. He had been the king of the world, the creator of the future. But now, he was just a man in the dark, wondering where it had all gone wrong. The lights outside his mansion flickered once more, and Will knew that it wasn't just the lights in the city that were dying. It was the last remnants of his empire, his legacy, and the world he had built. He had created this world, this empire of light, but now it was slipping away from him. And as the rebellion grew stronger, and the blackouts continued to spread, Will was left wondering, was there any way to reclaim it all? And then the strange thought occurred to him. What if it was time to let it all go? The rebellion was growing. His empire was dying. And maybe, just maybe, the lights would never come back on. Will's empire had once been a shining beacon, but now it was nothing more than a shadow of what had been, a reminder of what he had lost. It was time for the world to move on. And maybe, for once, Will Smith could too. If you're enjoying the unraveling of Will Smith's empire and the power struggles that have come with it, Don't miss out on the next series of our intense journey on celebrities in alternate timelines. Subscribe now to stay updated with every twist and turn of our unpredictable stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and join the ride.